how do the 5 elements relate to the seasons when the distinction between the different seasons is not so clear? That is going to be the topic of this episode of Chi Life. Okay, so this topic has come in as another question from someone watching the channel, and it's a good one. It's an interesting one, with a little bit of, we need to think about this in really practical terms and how our philosophy, our theoretical framework actually relates to what we're experiencing in our lives and our environment. If you're familiar with the idea of the 5 elements from Chinese philosophy, it carries through into Chinese medicine, into Qigong certainly, into things like Feng Shui, into all sorts of things. And it's a really useful framework, the idea of the 5 elements, understanding a nice orderly progression of different phases of energy and the relationships between them. Really, really useful in so many areas of our lives. We can apply it to the food we eat, to our emotions, to our physical environment, to our relationships with other people, and so on. And if you're interested in learning more about the 5 elements, particularly, excuse me, and about Qigong practices that relate to them, we go into quite a lot of depth in the Elemental Alchemy Qigong program, which I'll put a link to that information about that in the description below. We also work with Wuji and Taiji, so formless, yin and yang, onto the 5 elements. This is a progression within Chinese philosophy. Again, really practical to understand all of those parts and how they fit together. The 5 elements in particular are, as I mentioned, really, really fascinating. And one of the things that, they relate to everything in life. And so one of the things that people are often quite familiar with is how they relate to the seasons. Now, the most yin of the seasons is water. So, and then the most yang of the seasons is fire. Hang on, what am I saying? The most yin of the seasons, and therefore the water element, relates to winter. The most yang of the seasons is, and therefore fire, relates to summer. Now, they're so closely connected that, as you can see, you can often, when you think in these terms, you can kind of use them interchangeably. And you think, instead of summer, you just think fire. Instead of winter, you just think water. Because it's like they're so connected. Then the rising energy. This is the wood energy, and that relates to spring. When the plants are growing, the energy is going from yin to yang. It's coming upwards. Yeah. And then the descending energy, when the leaves fall off the trees, when things start to contract again, this is metal. Oh, that's only 4 elements. What about the 5th element? So the 5th element is an interesting one. It's the earth element. The earth is all about stability. And in relationship to the seasons, and in fact in relationship to lots of things, we can think of this in a couple of different ways. So one is that the earth element creates stability. And so in a way, it's actually in the center of all of the others, holding them all together, holding all of those phases in balance with one another. So you could think of it like a wheel with each of the elements, water, fire, wood, metal, out on the rim of the wheel. And then earth is in the hub, right in the center, holding it all together with spokes going out to them. When we think of the earth having this role in relationship to the seasons, often what happens at the end of a season, so that there's a particular aspect of what needs to happen in the energy that occurs. Winter, the water element, is about returning to the essence, drawing back inwards, right? And once that's done, then there's a period of stable energy or stable conditions, therefore stable energy at the end of the season before it moves into the next phase, which in this case after water would be wood, where the energy starts to rise, grow upwards. And then again, once it's sort of done its rising, growing upwards phase, then there's often a stable period at the end before it transitions to the next one, fire, summer, and so on. And so we can think of there being like a little phase of earth at the end of each of the seasons and before it moves on to the next one. Another way that the earth element is thought of in relationship to the seasons is as having its own place, sort of on the rim of the wheel. And at the time of year where often the conditions tend to be most stable, and this is late summer. So it's after the most active period of the energy, summer, energy is really active, really hot, fiery, and there's like, oh, we're just going to have a steady period before we get into the next thing. So the Indian summer, the late summer, that's often thought of as the earth season as well. So it relates to both of these things. Now, these qualities of the 5 elements can be really clearly seen in some parts of the world in their seasons, where you have a really clear winter, maybe where it snows and that sort of thing. You have a really clear summer where it's hot. The spring is really clear because it's like, yeah, after the snow, like all the plants are bare or the grass is dead, whatever, and you literally see everything start to grow. And again, the autumn is really clear, and the leaves falling off the trees, and all these things. It's like really clear distinction between the seasons. But then in some parts of the world, you don't have clear seasons, or not to that degree. Even where I live in New Zealand, in the northern part of New Zealand, we definitely do have summer, winter, spring, autumn, but not really nearly so clear as it is in some parts of the world, because our winters tend to be quite mild. No snow, that's for sure. Here everything's still green and blooming, and yeah, autumn. So it's not as clear. There's definitely a distinction, but it's not as clear as some parts of the world. And in some parts of the world, it's even less clear. If you're living somewhere in the tropics, on a tropical island, where it's just hot all year, and often what they have is a difference between a more wet season and a more dry season. And even in the dry season, it rains a lot, but there's much more subtle distinction in those different elemental qualities between the seasons. So what should we think of this? How should we interact with that? Because, depending where you live, so look, a lot of the time, a lot of your Qigong practice doesn't necessarily need to change too much with the seasons anyway, because there's basic things that help to keep us balanced most of the time, and so we do those regardless of what the season is. Now, there might be some things that we change, and again, the bigger the difference in the seasons, the more we'll change what we do at our Qigong practice. Because, like, for example, if we're somewhere where there's a really cold winter, we might need to do more to nurture our water during that winter period, and we also might need to actually have more fire in our practices to counterbalance the extreme winter, the extreme water of the environment around us. Similarly, if there's a really hot summer, we might need more water to counterbalance that in our practice, and so on. So there are things that will adapt. If we've got a nice clear spring, we might do more to nurture our wood. So there's things that we can do to adjust our practice in the seasons, but often our practice it's just things to keep us overall balanced all the time. So we don't necessarily need to change a lot. But yeah, it is helpful to think like, well, we're probably going to make more of these changes in places where there's more clear seasons. And it's not necessarily going to be as relevant in places where the seasons aren't so clear, where they're more similar, because we're not adjusting to as big of a change. But that pattern of the flow of the 5 elements is still really important to us. And we'll be going through this flow of the 5 elements in lots of ways anyway, like every day. It's not just a yearly cycle of the seasons. Every day there's a period of wood, growing upwards, a period of expansion, of peak activity of fire, a period of stability, a period of calming down, a period of returning to rest, returning to essence, just within any given day. And, within lots of things, projects that we work in that's going to go through these phases, things with our work, with our family. And it's helpful to be able to recognize these phases, but we might not see them reflected in the seasons around us so much. And sometimes it's important for us to have some of these bigger cycles in our lives as well, maybe a yearly cycle. And if the 5 elements are reflected in the seasons, it gives us a clear prompt to help us to make sure that we give attention to each of these things. The returning to essence of water, the growth of spring, of wood, the expansion, expression of fire, and the refinement of metal in autumn. The season helps to remind us and helps guide us in this. If we're not getting that from the seasonal cues around us, we might actually need to have more of a conscious focus on that to make sure that we are actually going through these phases within our life, so that we set aside some time to, so for example, for water, a returning to essence, this is often the time to meditate, to contemplate, to spend less time out and about doing other things. and the cold weather encourages us to do that, like be indoors, spend some time by yourself. If we're not getting that cold weather, we might need to institute that for ourselves, not necessarily by making it cold, but like by setting aside a period of time and go like, you know what, during the year, this period of time is going to be the time that I take some time away from all my outward expression and activities to go inwards. Yeah. And same for the other phases as well. We might need to sort of implement them for ourselves in order to keep ourselves functioning well if we're not getting those external cues from our environment. As an interesting extension of this, so that we talked about like the tropics where they don't have so much of a distinction of seasons. Something similar applies in places in the very north or very south of our planet where they get extreme changes of environmental energy with the seasons. And so this is, like very far north in Scandinavia or something like that, where they have really long, cold, dark winters, for example. And during those times, because it goes so far into the yin, into the water, into the dark, into the depths, that they need to take extra conscious care to actually bring in more fire to counterbalance that. And they have cultural traditions around this. I forget the word, but there's a word in some of the Scandinavian, is it hygge? Something like that. A word about being cozy and like sitting next to the fire. And so they're getting some fire to counterbalance the water. As I mentioned in one of the other vlogs I made recently, without enough sunlight, they also, often people in those environments actually need things like special UV lights that they expose themselves to stimulate their hormone production, vitamin D production, to keep their mood balanced and keep them healthy, right? So they need some fire to counterbalance the depths of the water element in winter. And also in summer in some of those places, because they've got so much light so much of the time, well, they need to implement some more darkness so that they get enough water, enough yin to counterbalance the yang of the season. And that might mean blackout curtains and things like that, so that they can rest effectively and give themselves the environmental energy they need to be fully healthy. When it comes down to it, as humans, we're really, really adaptable, and we can go into lots of different environments and do okay. But that doesn't mean it's optimum for us. And there's really a more moderate range of environments that are really, well, optimum and give us all of the things we need just naturally. And when we get into more extreme environments, and so this would be places really far north, we're really far south, or even on the equator, where it's like, oh, this is more extreme. This isn't actually our natural pattern. Sometimes to be fully healthy, we need to bring things in to give ourselves that natural pattern and that natural balance to our energy. So anyway, interesting question. I'm sure there's a lot more that could be said about it, but hopefully this gives a little bit of insight, a little bit of food for thought for people who are watching this, listening to this. Might apply to you, particularly if you live in the tropics or if you live somewhere extreme north or extreme south. Yeah, hope you've enjoyed it, and I look forward to seeing you on another vlog soon.